Welcome to Psychology the Daf. We are in Gemara Pesachim Daf Yodaled. Now, this Gemara offers an argument by saying Mikra Mole Diber Hakosov. The Torah gives a full pasuk, meaning to say that sometimes there are certain pshatim in the pasuk that are so self-evident that they don't require a special drasha. And actually, the poskim, from time to time, even achronim, will in some way present a proof from a pasuk without really having a prior drasha. Just the pasuk is so obvious that it makes its point. And we find a very fascinating example of this from the Noda B'Yehuda in Yeridea, Chelek Aleph, Siman Samach Tes. And in this case, the Noda B'Yehuda was asked a shaila about the following situation. A person was engaged, and as was the custom, they made a t'nayim, which t'nayim can be very serious, meaning there's a real agreement to get married, and should one break the engagement, they're liable for financial penalties. And what happened over here was that the Kala's grandfather ended up becoming an apostate after the engagement. So the question was, could the family of the chassan break off the engagement? Further complicating the matters was that even before the engagement, it was known that the Kala's grandfather ate treif. He ate unkosher food. So the Kala's side was making the argument, listen, you knew what you were getting into. You knew that in this family there was a grandfather who was improper in some way. So how could you claim now all of a sudden that he becomes an apostate, that this is such a terrible shame and impossible to marry into this family? So the Noda B'Yehuda ruled that, in fact, the chassan's side may break the engagement without financial penalties. And in doing so, he brings out a number of fascinating points. Point number one, he said, is that they may break the engagement because it is a mikra mole. It is an open pasuk in Shmos, Perek Chaf, pasuk Hey, which says that Hashem will visit the guilt upon the parents, upon the children, upon the third, and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me. That is the pasuk, that al b'nei vonim, al shilishim, al ribeim lisonai. So therefore, really, this is only a grandchild, and there's still going to be more children to come, and this some kind of terrible calamity can befall the descendants, and therefore the chassan's side could pull out. But even more, and this is why there's so many interesting points in this tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda, the fact that he's using an explicit pasuk. The second one is that he points out that even though we're taught according to Chazal that it's only that the children only suffer for the sins of the fathers when they follow in the evil footsteps of the fathers, and actually, as the pasuk says, "Leson oi," to those who hate me. Now, maybe the Pashut Pshat could be to the original one who did the hateful act, but Pashtus, it goes the other way too, and that's the drasha in any case. So even so, the chassan's side is still entitled to object, because the argument is that when the person follows in the evil footsteps of their ancestor, they will also suffer the sins of their ancestor. So the argument from the chassan's side would be as follows: even though it's true that the only time a punishment will come to our descendants is if one of our descendants also performs evil, but then that descendant will get even more punishment because he'll also get the sins of the fathers. And we don't want that. We'd rather them just suffer for their own sin. Further, the Noda B'Yehuda points out that you cannot compare in any way somebody who's eating treif to an apostate. And he says that even though the person was eating treif, even though he was eating unkosher food, there'd be no reason to necessarily expect or suspect that the grandfather would become an apostate. And it's fascinating, the language, because normally we're not in the habit of downplaying sin. Now, for the purpose of this particular responsa, he is downplaying the sin of eating treif. So he says that it's only a lav. And that's interesting because we're used to certain averas to be culturally so unacceptable that we consider it to be beyond the pale of Judaism. Somebody, a frum person, who starts eating treif, we just don't consider them Jewish or something. But that's a cultural feeling. That's not a halachic feeling. Halachically, they are Jewish. The issue here is an apostate is obviously a very different situation. So Noda B'Yehuda says that no, even though the grandfather was eating treif, there's no reason that the family should suspect that it would get worse, and therefore the fact that he became apostate gives them grounds to break off the engagement. And one last point that Noda B'Yehuda says, and that is this only applies to a direct descendant, not to a brother, a sister, an uncle, or an aunt. So it's only the grandfather, the great-grandfather, etc. And that's an important point too, because when it comes to shidduchim, there may be different criteria. And he brings again the proof from the pasuk, because it says b'nei vanim, it says sons and grandsons, shileshim ribeim, third generation, fourth generation. The implication is a direct line of descendancy.